You were right, of course. Starmer was decided to
We thought he might do that, didn't we, Lewis?
Together.
Exactly. Pick an issue, pick a big issue, something that is going to be at the forefront of voters' minds across the 3 by-elections taking place tomorrow. The NHS, but trying to tie in different themes with it. Started off talking about fiscal credibility, attacking the Tories almost from the sort of right, as it were, about unfunded spending plans and unfunded NHS workforce plans and so on. Then moving on to highlight Labour's policy of closing the non-dom tax loophole, as he calls it, and using that to invest in, well, quite a lot of things, but partly invest in the NHS, and then going on again to talk about Hillingdon Hospital, of course, in Uxbridge, where there is a by-election tomorrow. So quite politically savvy from Keir Starmer. Rishi Sunak hitting back about strikes, bringing in the Just Stop Oil line. We're going to hear a lot more from the Prime Minister, I think, about that as the election gets ever closer. It felt a bit like the last day of term, didn't it? Where everyone's had a little bit too much sun.
I mean, the Speaker kept saying, like, well, if you want to leave, if you want to get out on time, you want to leave early.
That won't have gone down well, will it?
No, exactly.
It's not recess yet.
Let's just end all of this now.
Yes, can't we just go to the pub? Yeah, not necessarily a great look from Lindsay Hoyle. But it's going to be right at the core of Labour's election campaign, the NHS, the state of the NHS, the fact that waiting list 7.3 million. Rishi Sunak pointing to some success, using the line that, do you remember Theresa May used to use endlessly when she was Prime Minister?
Strong and stable.
No, the state of the NHS in Wales. It almost became a running joke. Rishi Sunak dredging that one back up to say that waiting lists are higher in Wales. So bad-tempered, both leaders having their eye very much, I think, on tomorrow, but also on the break to come afterwards.
And it was notable. I mean, Sunak, although I was about to say he looked had a little bit more of a spring in his step than usual, but then again, we haven't seen him for so many weeks, so I suppose he's rather refreshed. But it was notable, as we thought, that not so much from Sunak, but we heard from Stephen Flynn, the SNP Westminster leader there, doing exactly what we thought, which is to try and advert to and point to some of the tension on the Labour benches. He's always got a good turn of phrase, talking about a spine looking for a shiver, or a shiver looking for a spine, whichever way it was, doesn't really matter, it just sounds good. And talking about the two-child policy, which is a sort of, and we were just about to get to this before we went to PMQs, it feels to me like this is a little glimmer, if there is, and all the polls are right, there's going to be a Labour government, a little glimmer of some of the tensions around that government, of a Labour government potentially existing in a framework and a fiscal situation where money is difficult.
Yes, I think that's spot on, Lewis. And there's been a sort of on-running debate going on in Westminster in the Labour Party about, is Keir Starmer just saying all this stuff to get into power? Once he's in number 10, is he going to become the sort of more left-wing, a bit more, not radical, but a bit more sort of bold and ambitious Prime Minister that his supporters hoped he would be? Is this just politically strategic in the sense? But the commitment to stick to Tory spending plans really rules that out in a sense, because if he's committed to doing that for the next first term in government, he can't then get into number 10 and say, great, thanks for electing me. Of course, we're still going to be sensible, but actually we are going to do this, this and this that I couldn't promise you I was going to do before. And that's why some Labour MPs who were initially saying, look, of course he's got to say these things now, but once he's in power, he's playing the game, he's saying what needs to be said to get into power. Trust me, when Keir's in number 10, things will be different. And now a bit like, oh, but hang on, we've just committed to not spending any more money than the government and not putting taxes up. So where's the money going to come from?
And people compare it to Blair and Brown in 97 because they did the same thing. But the difference was, of course, is the economy was motoring along in 97. So Blair and Brown could sit there, you stick to spending limits for 2 years, but then there's going to be this lovely pot of money that they'll be potentially able to tap into to start spending. That's not going to be the case. Almost certainly not going to be the case.
No, and the frustration that some Labour MPs have is, well, you can raise money. Keir Starmer was talking about PMQs, about the non-dom tax. The non-dom tax.
1.7 billion for this thing.
Exactly.
It's a tiny amount. For a government with £1 trillion budget, it's basically a rounding
error. But Labour also called it a windfall tax. So they have in the past set out plans to raise revenue to spend in public services. And what some in Labour are saying was, why can't we do that more? Why can't we come up with more populist tax policies in the way that the windfall tax was hugely popular? They say, why can't we have a windfall tax on the banks who are raking it in off the back of the interest rates?
Although you wouldn't know this from Twitter, of course, but actually the two-child policy is actually quite popular.
It is, including amongst Labour voters. Yeah. But again, it's that kind of tension between, yes, this specific policy is popular, therefore some in Labour say, well, we're right to support it. But the wider challenge, the wider threat to Keir Starmer isn't that he comes up with promises to scrap one policy that's unpopular. It's this wider theme of, who are you? Mr. Mr. Starmer. Who are you? What are you really about? Can we trust you? Because the risk is, does anybody really think that in his heart of hearts, Keir Starmer thinks the two-child benefit cap is the right thing? No. I don't think anyone believes that. And so when they hear him saying, well, no, we don't really like it, but we're not going to scrap it, the risk is people think, well, where's the strength? Where's the sort of determination?
And there is already a narrative about him dodging previous commitments, let's put it that way. And not just a narrative, indeed, he has moved away from commitments that he's made in the past, particularly when he was running for Labour leader. And of course, the person sitting next to him, as always, in Prime Minister's Questions, his deputy, Angela Rayner. She didn't look very happy.
She didn't. Well, she's called that policy obscene and inhumane. Yeah. Jonathan Ashworth, who's called it heinous, was on the around this morning saying, well, we can't scrap it. It was interesting that Stephen Flynn chose to focus both his questions, really, not on the government, but on Labour.
And that isn't the first time he's done that.
And it won't be the last, because, of course, for the SNP's perspective, their main challenge that they're trying to fend off in Scotland isn't from the Conservatives, it's from Labour. And this is a golden opportunity. And, those seats are going to be absolutely crucial, potentially, come the next general election. So Stephen Flynn, it's manna from heaven that Keir Starmer has ended up defending a Conservative-imposed benefit cap that the House of Commons Library says is keeping over 250,000 people in poverty, when his own deputy leader, his own work and pensions spokesperson have heavily condemned it. And he himself, when he ran for leader, promised to scrap it.
Well, I suspect that the SNP line going into the next general election again and again and again is going to be basically a variant of what George Galloway used to call, and apologies to listeners for dredging up this image, but two cheeks of the same backside. That's what George Galloway used to call it. But let's not think about George Galloway's backside or anybody else's. Not at this time of the afternoon. Other thing, we should talk about Rishi Sunak. The person who's sitting next to him is Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, who, of course, she's got her bit of legislation through the Parliament this week, but also she's had something to say about another affair. In this case, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Farage-Coots affair, just in case any of you thought 2023 was going to be less weird, she's actually tweeted in support of Nigel Farage and against Coots.
The Coots scandal, this is Suella Braverman on Twitter, exposes the sinister nature of much of the diversity, equity and inclusion industry. Apparently, anyone who wants to control our borders and stop the boats can be branded xenophobic and have their bank account closed in the name of, quote, inclusivity. She says NatWest and other corporates who have naively adopted this politically biased dogma need a major rethink. This is also an issue for the public sector. That's pretty off-brief, Lewis. I mean, she's trying to link it to small boats. Secretary. It's nothing to do with her brief. It's nothing to do with her department. There's pressure on the Treasury to put pressure on the regulators to ban this sort of thing. If Jeremy Hunt had come out and said something...
Well, Jeremy Hunt has said that he himself has refused a Monzo account.
He has indeed. Point, So if Jeremy Hunt had made a statement, and there was some suggestion there might even be a statement in the Commons on this, if he had said something as Chancellor, obviously it would have been interesting, it would have been newsworthy, but no one would have batted an eyelid. The fact the Home Secretary is tweeting shortly before PMQs about banks... Well,
it's arguably,
cynics would say that she might have a leadership contest in a year's time in mind.
Well, quite so. And indeed, Farage and GB News and this sort of ecosystem which has now developed around the right of the Conservative Party will be very important in that campaign. It shows again, doesn't it, though, that Farage, whether you love him or loathe him, he continues to be able to create media narratives, to create stories, and indeed, as Braverman herself has now showed, to have an impact on Conservative Party politics and thinking, especially on the right of the party, which is now dominant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if he does make a rumoured return to frontline politics before the next election, he's still a player in national politics. And, if you're the Reform Party, I think you are hoping he does come back. And if you're Rishi Sunak, you're desperately hoping he doesn't, because splitting the vote in that way, even in a small number of seats, could again prove to be pretty crucial.
But it's sort of slightly clear as mud at the moment, isn't it? This sort of, in case listeners haven't been following this is the sort of ongoing story which has been going for a couple of weeks now about whether or not, well, there's no dispute about the fact they've done it, but Coots shutting down this elite bank, ironically, shutting down Nigel Farage's bank account. And the dispute is over the reason. And it appeared a week or so ago that basically Coots was saying, or had briefed, that Farage just didn't have the money to have this bank account anymore. And now Farage says he's got these documents which show that wasn't the case. That it was actually, in fact, for political reasons that they were asked him to shut down the account.
Yes, that it was opposed to their values and their morals, and his support for Trump and his support for other political causes was counter to the image they were trying to convey. That's according to documents that Nigel Farage has obtained under what's called a subject access request, where you can ask an organisation for all the files relating to you. Important to say, Lewis, we've still only got Nigel Farage's word for this. This is his claim.
He's not exactly a disinterested party.
No, he's not, and there has been times in the past where he's suggested something that turned out to be slightly different to what was actually going on. So important to say that. But look, there's people across the political spectrum who are saying, look, if this is true, if a bank has rejected somebody for a bank account because they don't like their politics, then that sends a pretty worrying precedent. It sends a pretty concerning signal, because, of course, the logical conclusion of that could be quite a dark place.
Yeah, and it's not a luxury to have a bank account. It might be a luxury to have a Coots bank account, but I would imagine.
Well, you have to have £1 million, I think, to bank with Coots.
Yeah. I've not inquired, I've got to be honest, man. I mean, maybe it's something to aim for.
Maybe one day.
Maybe. Well, no doubt after your winning drive time performance later, you'll get endless donations to open one up. See you at 4 o'clock.
See you at 4 o'clock.
Ben Kentish there, LBC's Westminster editor.